Each year, Microsoft Research hosts hundreds of influential speakers from around the world, including leading scientists, renowned experts in technology, book authors, and leading academics, and makes videos of these lectures freely available.
My pleasure this morning to introduce Larry Birnbaum from Northwestern University, where he heads the Knight News Innovation Center that he may say a little bit about during the talk. It's a recently funded effort by Knight Ridder to do lots of exploration about how to present textual and maybe multimedia information in ways that are very different than we currently do with news feeds. And so today, Larry's going to talk a little bit about a couple of things that he's been working on. One is a general notion of context and how that's important in we worry about it a lot in understanding queries, but also in presenting results to people. And I think you're going to talk about a fun project on text generation that takes raw data feeds, typically numeric, and tries to generate an interesting narrative around them, mostly for sports scores, but for lots of other things. And so I think historically Larry's work has really been at the intersection of AI and natural language and interfaces with people doing real tasks on real web scale systems. So Larry, it's a pleasure.
Susan, thank you very much. Eric claimed he would watch this later.
So let's say hi to Eric.
So $5, Eric, if you actually do watch this later. Thanks for having me. This talk will be a little bit personal and I don't know, you can either solipsistic or narcissistic as the case may be, but talk a little bit about kind of our own struggles and by all means chime in with your struggles as they pertain to it. I started out doing sort of big semantic modeling of the old school in natural language, and I love those models. The models we built like 25 years ago, I think there was a lot of beauty to those models, and even a lot of truth to those models, but there were a lot of things I didn't understand at that time, in fact, that none of us understood, and I think the first thing, which is idiotic, that I didn't understand it, was that if it doesn't scale, there's no point in doing it on a computer, and it might seem ridiculous for someone to be trained in computer science and not understand that, but I was and I didn't. But the other thing is that, and I think this is a sort of a well-known maxim now, which is that scalability is not something that you ever add later. It's got to be baked in from the beginning in whatever it is that you're doing. And as we started thinking about how do we cope with these realities, I was working with my colleague Chris Hammond, and he is the one who really got me interested originally in looking at problems in information retrieval and intelligent information systems and thinking about how larger semantic models could be built on top of the processes that information retrieval and statistical methods generally provide us, and kind of help to make them do kind of interesting things. So we started in this work about a dozen years ago with this as our challenge, or more than a dozen years ago. It is easier for a rich man to get into heaven than it is for you to actually take the context of what you're thinking and stick it in this little box and have the machine really do the right thing. Yet it works okay, but when it doesn't work, that's extraordinarily frustrating. And so we got interested in the idea of just avoiding this entirely, just get rid of this thing, And so our system, in some sense, is the unfortunately named Watson system of Jay Budsick, our PhD student. And this, I again have to say, was more Chris's work and Jay's. I mean, I was I contributed some things to this project, but I was really more of a kibitzer. But Watson was one of, and there were a number of systems at this time. There was also the Remembrance Agent at the Media Lab was done. It was a similar system. I liked ours, actually. I thought it was a really good one. But what Watson did is it would look at a document that you were reading and writing or writing online in a variety of applications, for instance in PowerPoint, and it would analyze it statistically and heuristically, and then it would go out and it would build some queries and manage those queries and come back with stuff that was relevant to what you were doing. And it was a really good system, and it worked exceptionally well. I mean, it would come back with the stuff which was really very on point, like here's a PowerPoint on jazz and the American culture, and you get all this great stuff about a passion for jazz, styles of jazz music, blah, blah, blah. It's pretty good stuff. And it worked really well. It was fast, it was automatic, and it was twice as good as you. And what I mean by that is that when Jay ran studies where he would take a a query that you would write, and by you I mean a master's student in computer science, and ship to a search engine, and then one that was automatically generated by ones that were automatically generated by the system, and you could put together multiple ones too, and then mash up the results and give them back to you to identify whether you thought they were on point. You would say that well north of 60% of Watson's results were on point, whereas yours were in the 30 to 40% range. So it seemed like a fantastic opportunity to start a company, which we did. And it didn't work. The company didn't work. And I'm not going to, I think it's pretty clear what the system did at sort of a high level, so I'm not going to go through this. It didn't really work. And what we found out as we started showing it to people for real, to say, hey, you should use this in your knowledge management system, you should use this in your productivity system in some way, shape, or form, is people would come back and say, these results are tremendously on point, they're just not very interesting. It's more of the same. It's like, it's what I started with. It's the same stuff over and over again. And we had a duh moment, which I think a lot of other people in this business have had, which is we were doing what everybody else does. We were using similarity as a proxy for relevance, and actually similarity as a proxy for relevance has its strong points and its weak points, very obviously, and our final realization of its weak points is what's the most similar document to a document you have in your hand is another copy of that document, which is completely, well, it might be useful to know that somebody else has a copy of that document, but that's a completely different kind of information than information that's contained in the document. So we had this realization that that would make something useful would be for it to be similar in certain respects and dissimilar in other respects. And I think lots of other people have had this realization too, obviously. Watson was relying on the size of the internet and basically on noise to actually bring back stuff that might be useful to you, that might be enough on point to be relevant and enough off point to actually add information. And the question that came to our mind was, can we do better than that? I'll back up, actually. I'll do this one. So this is actually an older copy of a competitor's news system, which I think of as an interesting failure. I don't know what they think about it. It's a little bit better than this now, and we'll talk about the ways in which it is better. But for example, it gives you a bunch of stories ranked by how many stories are like this or something. Whatever they're using for that, and it'll show you. It'll show you this thing here. If you don't want to look at this one, you can look at 533 other stories, which you're not going to look at. That's a lovely engineer's number right there. It's sort of like no one's going to look at those stories, and they don't show, unless you actually do the expansion, they don't show this to you anymore. They don't actually they don't put this number in your face. But then there's the question to me of why are they showing me a story from Fox News, and why is the alternative something from Businessweek Bloomberg, or why are they showing me something from the Wall Street Journal, and why is the Baltimore Sun an alternative thing to show me? These again are very kind of, those things are particularly hermetic, it seems to me. It's very unclear why they're showing me that. They're optimizing something, but it's not clear what they're optimizing. And I guess to sort of cut to the chase is that we started to come to the realization that these are editorial decisions that these systems are making. What editors do is they do attentional engineering. They decide what is going to get your attention by positioning it on a page or in a place or at a time when they think it will have your attention. And these machines are making editorial decisions, and they're applying editorial values to make editorial judgments, and we actually don't have any clear idea about what their editorial values are or how they're making the editorial judgments that they're making. And I actually dare say that the engineers who built that thing I showed you have no clue either, because they don't think of themselves for the most part as editors, and they don't think of themselves as making editorial judgments. They just think of themselves as they're trying to optimize something, although I don't think they're just not thinking about it that way. We'll talk about the ways in which that's improved in a minute. So we ended up starting to think that what we really wanted here was a deliberate mechanism for finding alternatives or for pursuing information relationships. And here's the thing where I think we can have some discussion or debate, which it seemed to us that this is where kind of our preference for semantic approaches actually might play a role, because to be deliberate, it seemed to us you had to be thinking about dimensions of similarity and dissimilarity that actually had some kind of semantic component to them. I'll tell you what I mean. You could look back at what Watson was doing wrong and say, what I really want to do is look for the golden donut of things that are dissimilar enough that they're useful, and or the golden, I don't know what you'd call it. It's the golden, it's not a donut. It's like a nested spheres, right? It's the sort of things that are far enough away from where you started to be interesting, but not too far away to be useless. And so you can imagine this kind of area. And that does, I think, and people work on that, and I think that's a really good idea. But again, you're not getting any notion of you're still depending on noise and the size of the internet to bring back stuff. You're not actually, in a deliberate or thoughtful fashion, deciding to explore that space. You're actually just saying, okay, this is where the sweet spot will be, and I think that's good. So we got interested in the idea of specific dimensions of similarity and dissimilarity that we could look at for particular content verticals. So here's an example. And actually, this was the point of the thing we did just earlier this morning when we looked at that. But so this is we actually did a similar system to Watson for, and you'll have to excuse me for a minute. These shoelaces are really not well designed, and I should get new ones, but I don't. We did a system like that for video that looked at the metadata associated with video and would bring back relevant information as well, and it worked pretty nicely. It brings back a bunch of recipes relevant to the things he's talking about here. You know, if you type in lasagna recipe to a search engine, actually it keeps growing. This morning's result were 10 million results for lasagna recipe. The last time I looked, it was 6 million results for a lasagna recipe, and the last time I looked before that, it was 1 million results. But the point is, there's a lot of lasagna recipes online. And if I'm showing you a lasagna recipe already, the question is, and this is the problem with Watson. Watson would bring you back 10,000 other lasagna recipes, and that's completely pointless, right, at some level. And so this is like, I think this will be obvious, but maybe to get a little thing going here, like, what should I show you if I'm showing you a lasagna recipe? This is actually a question.
Facets.
Right.
Metadata.
Right. So so in particular, what kinds of let me put it another way. If I'm already showing you a lasagna recipe, what other lasagna recipes should I show you that would actually be useful to you?
Better lasagna recipes.
Better lasagna recipes. That's true. So highly thought of lasagna recipes. What else?
Different ingredients.
Right. Vegetarian lasagna recipes, low-calorie lasagna recipes, low-salt lasagna recipes, easy lasagna recipes, classic lasagna recipes, okay? And in fact, if you go and do query completion on a search engine, like if you type lasagna recipe L, you'll get low salt, low fat, low cal, low carb even, which I think is fascinating. But okay, maybe so. I'd love to hear about that.
Those are all refinements. You could also find other things that are related to lasagna in an interesting way, so share ingredients with, but are not lasagna.
Absolutely.
And you don't see very much of that.
Absolutely. So other recipes you might consider cooking if you were
things that complement it, like a nice salad or a right wine.
What's the right wine? Absolutely. What's the good, Caesar salad and Chianti, or whatever it is you should have with, and garlic bread. I guess that's the standard cheap. I mean, at some point in everybody's life, in their, let's say, 22 to 23 years old, it's lasagna, garlic bread, Caesar salad, and a bottle of Chianti. I think that's a nice. You cook somebody a nice dinner when you've done that. So it's still a nice dinner. I don't mean to be patronizing. I can't even cook it even today. But so that's what we ended up doing. We ended up saying, look, we're going to actually, now if you have a lot of data, and if you want to go mining, you can actually find these things in what people are asking for. We actually like to take a relatively simple approach because, frankly, I think a person who edits cookbooks knows perfectly well, I mean, they're a professional at what kind of information people actually need to know about recipes or what other alternatives they'll want. And I think while I am prepared to believe that there will be a lot of undiscovered gems of kinds of relationships in the data that people who build cookbooks never thought of in their imaginations, on the other hand, there will be things that experts know would be useful to you that won't typically show up in query logs because not enough people will grasp that they should have looked at that, for example, okay? And yet it could have been there. So we're actually very interested in the idea of putting a tool in the hands of an editor that will say, take this recipe and mutate it in the following ways to find the things that you want, And we're also interested in things like how would you find out whether it was a quick and easy lasagna recipe? Well, it might say quick and easy in it, or you might look at it and you might actually see how many steps it has in it, or et cetera. So you can imagine lots of ways to actually estimate that. This is just a way of saying that when you go through the sort of what Watson did, our Watson, the original Watson, it's these places where you can actually make a decision about what am I going to look at in the context, how am I going to select the sources, how am I going to query, form the queries, how am I going to do all these things. These are all the little places in the algorithm where you can stick in a little bit of nudging or control, in relatively simple ways. Thank you very much. So, so let me talk about a couple of other systems that we built along these lines that I thought was kind of fun. This was built by my student Jiawei Liu, and the idea here was if you give Watson a story about, for example, Israel's use of cluster bombs in the 2006 Lebanon War. Is that when it was? There have been so many, unfortunately. You will get back 50,000 other stories about Israel's use of cluster bombs in that war. If you give this to her system, what you will get back will be stories about U.S. use of cluster bombs in Iraq, NATO use of cluster bombs in the Balkans and in Afghanistan. And so the idea was to actually try and find stories that had a very similar activities or actions, but were located in different places or involved different actors. And so here's an example. This is a case of Oracle tried to buy MySQL, and we get back actually IBM as the comparable entity, and it goes out and it finds stories about IBM basically trying to pursue an open source strategy in a variety of other places. So, for example, these are two stories it found, and it actually tells you what got kind of what corresponded to what in some sense, right, in these things and what was in common. So. So you can see that the idea here was that maybe you would actually understand this story better by virtue of comparing it to something that was a little bit different from it. That would actually be a way of actually coming to some better understanding of it. This is the this is.
Was it comparison based on entities, like different?
Absolutely. So it's a relatively simple thing. It didn't. So I'll come back to that in a second. We actually did a couple of things where we could do, for example, if you did a story about, for instance, GM laying off workers, it might find a story about Honda hiring workers or Ford hiring workers. So we could look a little bit at antonymic activities, and it could do things around adjectives. So if you gave it a story about a bloody coup somewhere, it might come back with a bloodless coup, with a relatively peaceful coup. So it actually had some capacity to do that kind of thing. But in general, that's right. It was actually what it did is it took the sort of top stuff in the story, it ripped out the named entities, it did a search just with that, without any named entities in it, and it was doing that to mine similar named entities. And the reason is that all the stories it'll find that way are the comparable stories it'll find, but they're pretty mixed in all over the place because they're not very highly ranked. So it did that to try and mine, for instance, IBM or NATO or Afghanistan versus Lebanon, for example. And once it mimed those things, which it did by finding similar sentences high up in the first paragraph where they played similar syntactic roles, it would then go back and reformulate the query using those entities it had found. Does that make sense? Okay. And it was I thought it was a reasonably successful system, at least in finding things like that were a little bit different, that might actually add value to your understanding of the situation. There was something else I was going to say that I'll get back to it later. I actually wanted to use something like this was her idea. I actually had wanted to just use, this was a case where I thought that actually pre-built taxonomies would be helpful. Like, for example, the Department of Commerce has lists of U.S. companies classified by industry. And you could imagine saying, I'm just going to go through that and say, here's another company, and I'm just going to go through and systematically substitute in these names off this list. We tried to use actually, Brand X's sets operation to do this. it didn't work that well, interestingly enough. It didn't help us. I will say something about what this says about the kind of information retrieval compared to logic and why we were doing this. So what you really want to say here is, I want a story, for example, you might say something like the following. I want a story about, I'm looking at a story about, let's say, Iran and nuclear proliferation and nuclear weapons. And I want a story like this that's not about Iran, because I want to think about similar cases or similar situations that have happened previously. I can't just take some compressed query about this thing and add not Iran. Okay, that's going to be the wrong thing for a variety of reasons. First of all, a lot of the specificity in queries comes from names, because that's what names are for. I mean, names exist to be relatively individuated symbols that stand for something, and a lot of the oomph and indexing comes from them, a lot of the specificity. But the second reason is that somebody might have actually written an entire case study about comparing Iran with North Korea or Libya or whatever, right? And that's actually something you do want to retrieve. And so if you say not Iran, you're shutting yourself out. This is just a way of saying that negation doesn't work properly in IR systems, because they're not full-blown predicate logic systems. So when you want to do something like negation, what you have to do is actually do substitution of the things that you mean otherwise. So not Iran means Iraq, Libya, North Korea, whatever the United States is currently categorizing as, rogue states or something like that. So that becomes the, does that make sense? So that's sort of the model here of sort of building, and again, this is sort of our notion of building a little bit more complicated semantics on top of what the information retrieval systems afford us. These are kind of, some of the numbers I present here are always, I'm not the best evaluator in the world, but my students are better than me. The precision was pretty good, so about 70% or so of the stuff that came back, people would look at it and say, yeah, this is a good analogy to the story you originally gave me. The recall is a little bit funny, but I'll tell you what that means. So it turns out that reporters will very often allude to comparable cases in the stories that they give you. And so what Jiawei did is she took the actual comparable cases that were alluded to in the set of stories that she was starting about the original query, whatever that was, the original topic, whatever that was, and she took, down to some depth, like 20 or 50 or whatever, and then she took all of those situations and said, did the system find those? And the answer is it found them about 60% of the time. It doesn't mean that you get the point. It doesn't mean that the things it found that weren't there weren't good ones. They were perfectly good. They just weren't the ones. So this is actually something that BrandX, I think, took to heart. So Jiawei went to intern at Google News while she was doing this work. And, this relates to the fact that it shows you these stories, and that shows you the follow-up stories will be, Bloomberg Business Week, and why are you showing me that, And we had this realization that if you see, let's say you see a story coming out of Pakistan, and you read about it on the New York Times or CNN, and the next question is, well, where else would you like to read about it? I've already seen it on, maybe The Guardian will give me a slightly different point of view, you know what I'm saying? But it's still, London as opposed to New York. The minute you ask yourself this question, it answers itself. What you're interested in is, what are people in Pakistan saying about this? That's the obvious question, So if you happen to know that the Dawn of Lahore, Pakistan is actually one of the premier English language news sites in Pakistan, you can go and see what they're saying about it. But we didn't know that until we started this project. And so this is actually a very simple piece of technology. It just has it just basically has lists of interesting venues that are associated with countries, locations, stakeholders, like organizations. And it just says, if the story is about them, go look at what they say about this. Okay? So, for example, here's Putin visiting Iran when he was, this was in 2007. So I guess he was president before he became president again. And here you can see that in Iran it finds a story, it finds some stories about, that are from Iran about this visit in addition to the standard stories. It actually sees that the United States is actually related, and a variety of other organizations. It looks at them from each of their points of view in some sense. So actually, if you look at BrandX's news site now, you will see that they do, when it's relevant, identify the location that the news is from and try and show you a So if the news is out of Philadelphia, they'll try and show you something from Philadelphia as well. So, and I think that's a really good idea, and it's a very simple idea. It's not a very technically difficult idea. It's 11 o'clock.
11 minutes left.
I'm sorry?
11 minutes left.
Oh, that's right, 11 minutes, right. Right, 11. 11, good. I was confused. We're counting down. It's almost like New Year's. So I hope this makes sense. And I like the system for that reason. I mean, this is an example of the kind of system I like to build because it's technically not that hard, and I think it sort of implements a relatively obvious semantic idea, and it does it in a straightforward way, and it works. This is one that I think was a little bit more challenging that we did, that Jiao Wei did as well. And somebody gave me this fabulous word, epistemic dimensions. I was trying to cast about for what was I. So the idea was I want to look at a topic, and I want to look at it from multiple points of view. And by multiple points of view, I don't mean liberal versus conservative or for versus against. I really wanted something a little bit more abstract than that. Like practical versus theoretical would be an example of what I mean by a dimension like that. And what we ended up here was like, I want to talk about a story from a business point of view, a religious point of view, a technical point of view, a medical point of view, a legal point of view. For example, if I put in a topic like abortion, I could look at abortion from a legal or a political or a medical or a religious point of view. And I'd get really different, very different kinds of, and so again, I think these are the kinds of dimensions I'm thinking about when I say, look, I'm looking for systematically different dimensions of information. This is the kind of dimension that is exciting to me. Here's an example of when the EU was going after Intel. This was either before or after they went after you guys, or whatever other large American company they decided to go after. But that's their job. You know what I'm saying? So I don't think we should begrudge the EU's their mission. So here we have a technology and IT entrepreneur point of view on this issue, and then you can find blog entries about lawyers and basically on the legal point of view, and these typically came from lawyers and legal blogs.
What are those numbers on top?
That's how many it found, I guess. It didn't go that deep. In general, we're not really that into completeness. I mean, we're going to be showing things to people rather than aggregating them, and so precision is more important than recall for us. I'm surprised the numbers are so low, but it is what it is. I'm not sure how deeply she dug. The main thing that we were interested in doing this when we did this is we didn't want to have to actually download the actual contents of the documents to analyze them. We wanted to see if we could do it from the snippets. And it turned out that this worked because bloggers are relatively consistent in these epistemic points of views that they take on topics. In other words, a blogger who typically takes a legal point of view may take a legal and a political point of view, but does that make sense? I hope that sort of makes sense. So you could actually so what the system did is once a blog entry came back as relevant to this topic, you would look at the source, and the first thing you do is you'd say, well, have I analyzed this source before, because it would cache those results, and if it had, then it would just say, oh, this is a thing from a legal point of view, good. And if it didn't, then it would just go back and do a query just for the source alone to get back 20 snippets, 20 random snippets basically, or recent snippets of documents from this person, and then it would analyze those. And then we had, at this point, I'm just going to say there's a bunch of details about how to do that, but it actually turned out to be the case that it was better to classify the snippets independently and then aggregate those results than to throw all the snippets into one document and try and categorize that. And that's what this says. I can't believe I'm putting up something with the word neural net in it, but I am. That happens. So actually, it worked pretty well. When people looked at the results, they thought that they were A, on point, and B, represented that point of view 80% of the time. I'm trying to remember what this means. I think it means that of the I think it means that if you did the query from when you just did the query, if you looked in the query yourself in the top 20 or 50 things, what percentage of the things that you would actually say was on that point of view did it actually find? So this is conditional on the fact on what came back from that query. It's not actually casting into the web anew to find something. I hope that makes sense. Does that make sense to everybody? Here's a system that was built by our student Francisco Jacobelli. I really like this because it's really dirt simple. There are these metrics for novelty that people work on in a variety of sort of text tracking kind of things. And he actually invented a couple of new ones, but he basically said, look, I want to look at a news story, and then I want to find other news stories on this topic that have new information in them. And he's defining new information extremely syntactically and simply. New information is just additional actors, additional data, or additional quotes, okay? So it's going to look through these related stories and it's going to find, either because they're already clustered together in a news source or because he'll dynamically generate the queries a la Watson to do that, our Watson again. And then he'll actually start digging through these stories to find stories that have these additional information. And for example, this was done, as you can see at the time, last year when the BP well was out of control in the Gulf of Mexico, and it goes through the story in the Tribune and it finds other stories that are like it. For example, that have additional actors in them. For example, this company Magellan Midstream Partners LP, or the American Petroleum Institute. It finds this additional numbers. So, for example, this story doesn't talk about it, but it turns out that the technicians want to be able to find that the pressure readings in this containment cap has to be able to handle 8,000 to 9,000 pounds per square inch, and also that the vessels that will be collecting oil on the surface have to be able to hold between 2.5 and 3.5 million gallons a day of oil. That's what they're going to try and collect. So these were the additional numbers that it found. And then finally, some additional quotes. Here's a quote from the hope is that we can slowly turn off the valves, close the capping completely, and then test the pressure to see how the well is performing. Okay, said Thad Allen, the government's point man on the disaster. Okay, so that's an additional quote. The metric he used, by the way, for whether he should, so again, he's finding a bunch of these things, and the question is, and in general, we didn't have a lot of real estate here, and which 2 or 3 was he showing you? And here he did use the inverted pyramid model. So the idea was that a new name, number, or quote that was higher up in the story that you found it in, it would actually prefer to show that one on the grounds that some human being thought it was important enough to put high up in the story somewhere.
Did you use time at all to look at stuff that happened after this?
So this is not new in the sense of yeah.
In terms of novel, but if I've already read this, I may know previous history. So it's sort of like the notion of relevance versus interestingness. The things that are after this might be more interesting to me.
It didn't, but it should have. You're right. I mean, yeah, the newness here just simply meant additional information as opposed to genuinely new. Okay. I mean, I could imagine an application certainly where, there's the old story that, all the estimates change over, typically like in disasters and so on as they get updated. So you would certainly imagine that you'd want to paw through and find the most recent numbers about something. And that's something I'd be interested in. I mean, I'm not averse, for example, to saying I'm going to have a relatively small model of a disaster. And by small, I don't mean a complete model of what natural disasters are like, but just that disaster stories go through the following progression. There's the original situation, there's some numbers and metrics associated with that, which will be the extent of the storm or the size of the tsunami or the range of it. The next thing will be will be numbers of people killed or injured, destroyed, and so those numbers will start to build over time, and then eventually you'll start to hear about rescue efforts, right? So that kind of model of the time course of a relatively crude model of the time course of a natural disaster and its aftermath. And we haven't done that particular one, but that's exactly the kind of thing that I'm talking about. I'm very happy to build a relatively simple model like that, just out of my head, and say, okay, this is now I'm going to be looking for I'm not going to be looking for tweets or whatever that meet the things in each of these stages that I've identified, right, as a way of sort of organizing the thing. And that'll bring some of that temporality with it, but it's not automatically determined. I'm not going to talk about this or this. This was very precise, which was good. I mean, actually, sometimes it would identify, I don't know how it did this, but it would identify as new information something that was not, in fact, new information, or maybe it wasn't on point. By recall here, again, we mean that of the things that came back from these queries, or that were in this cluster, that you should have identified as being, for instance, a new quote, did you actually identify it? And again, I honestly, I can't tell you why it wasn't perfect. It should have been perfect. So all of these systems are have this nice property that they're contextualized. I mean, the spectrum isn't quite that way. I mean, you still have to type a query into spectrum, but I know we're all on pins and needles now. That's why I'm. There it is. Okay, 11, 11, 11, 11. Is this 5? I guess that's 5, right? 11, 11, 11, 11, 11. Okay. Yeah, 5 11s. That's better. 5 11s beats 6 sigma or something. I don't know. That's what it reminded me of for some reason. It's an auspicious moment to be giving a talk. So we ended up we usually got rid of the search box, or we at least had something that was allowing you to identify these dimensions and bring back sort of interesting stuff. But the output was the same. It was like a list of results. And at some point it dawned on us, and this has dawned on lots of other people, that you don't want 100 stories, you don't want 10 stories, you want one story. And I think this is not a dream that's only our dream, but I think what we are all thinking now is that you're walking around in the world and sort of one information experience. I don't necessarily mean a story or a document, but one information experience that is tailored for you right now, that addresses your needs right now, is dynamically constructed based on the information that's available in the world and presented to you, and that you can interact with. And I think that's kind of what we're all kind of thinking now. Synthetic documents, in other words. So Chris built this, and his student Nate Nichols built this really nice gizmo called News at 7. It was a lot of fun, and that might have been, in some sense, was our first foray into this. And what it did is it imitated Siskel and Ebert. You would give it the name of a movie, and then it would go to IMDb, and it would also go to Rotten Tomatoes, and it would pull out positive and negative reviews. And then, first of all, we'll look to see whether this was a polarizing movie or not, okay, because it would do different things. But if it was a polarizing movie, it would pull out positive and negative reviews, and he, for instance, would become positive, and she would become negative, or vice versa. And then they would talk about the movie. And in the meantime, in the background, you'd have little stills from the movie or B-roll from the movie running, and they would actually argue about it. And one of the reasons for doing this, by the way, is that synthetic voices are still kind of crufty, and so it turns out that actually listening to two of them alternating is not quite as obnoxious as listening to one drone on and on and on. And so that was part of the reason there was sort of that presentational thing. But it kind of worked okay. And I'll tell you, my addition to this was. And this, again, it comes back to this idea like simple dimensions or simple semantics. What do people talk about when they talk about a movie? What do they talk about? They talk about the acting. They talk about the directing. They talk about the music, the story. I mean, if they're really into it, they talk about the costumes or the production values or the cinematography, okay? So the idea is there are these dimensions of movie analysis or criticism, for want of a better word. And to some extent, the system did try to kind of keep itself on point. In other words, if it found a quote from some guy saying, I thought X was a great actor in this movie, it would come back with either if it could find somebody saying they thought X was a lousy actor in the movie, or at least find some other person who was a lousy actor in the movie and talk about that, okay? So that you'd actually get the, does that make sense? It would kind of keep, and if it couldn't do that, it would just change the subject, which actually turned out to be amazingly effective. In other words, when you listen to this thing, you actually, that got us to thinking, actually, how often did Siskel and Ebert actually talk to each other as opposed to just sort of saying whatever it is that they thought they were saying. There were sort of syntactic clues that they were having a conversation. It wasn't a real conversation, was it? I think the interesting question about a thing like that, well, there are a lot of questions about this. One is, it is a fun experience to watch it. The next question is it adding any value in the world? In other words, those comments are already out there, and you can go to Rotten Tomatoes and read them yourself. And the question becomes, do they gain any additional meaning by being embedded in a document like this or an experience like this that is, is the whole greater than the sum of the parts, in other words? Because if it is, we're adding value when we build a thing like this, and if it isn't, we're not, I think we thought it was. I think we thought that actually pulling things together like this kind of made them more poignant or more something. But we were, we were still sort of, this is still working by bricolage. In other words, it's not generating anything. It does have a simple rhetorical model of a back and forth argument like this, and it does have a notion of the kinds of topics that matter in movies, but it doesn't have, it's not actually generating any text on its own. So that got us interested in the idea of sort of generating, back into the idea of, interested in the idea of generating stories, which is something we thought about. I mean, stories is something we've thought about for a long time. And we had this brainwave, which it turns out other people have had too, because there's never any good new ideas in the world. Everybody's had them, but of kind of generating stories from data. And actually, this got a lot of currency. So we actually hit XKCD, which excited me because, I'll have to tell you something. I didn't even know what the fuck XKCD was, actually, until one of my students showed this to me, and I was like, wow, we made XKCD, what does that mean? But apparently it meant something good. So a weighted random number generator just produced, I love that weighted, by the way, a weighted random number generator just produced a new batch of numbers. Let's use them to build narratives, all sports commentary. So this is what we built, actually. And I should say something about how we built it. One of the things that we've been doing in the last few years is teaching joint courses with the journalism school. So Northwestern has a very famous school of journalism called the Medill School of Journalism. And we started teaching joint courses with them about 3 years ago, and what I mean by that is these are joint projects classes where we take computer science students and journalism students and we stick them in these classes, and we stick them on teams together, and then we give them an assignment, and then we mentor them gently yet firmly to try and get something built in the course of a quarter. And actually, we gave this project to generate sports stories from. And even the sports stories thing was sort of accidental. We were sitting around thinking, what should we do? And we thought, it has to be a field where there's a lot of data. We thought, well, sports or business? We decided to go with sports. I think that was a good idea, actually. I think business, it turns out that, so there's now a company, Narrative Science, which is commercializing this technology. I hope, so far successfully, so far so good. But obviously, business is a much more a part of their product line than sports is, because that's where the money is. But sports turned out to be a really good thing to do. We haven't hooked it to a random number generator yet, although we probably should. We thought about fantasy sports actually, and doing that kind of thing. Let me show you what it builds. So here is this is not the one that was built in the class. So we built we had two great journalism students actually on this team with us, and one of them actually was a developer also. So, and one of them was a budding sports journalist, which was one of the reasons why sports turned out to be useful. This is the data from a game. Actually, this is not from the proof of concept that came out of the class, but from the first real prototype that we built in the lab. We love this project, and we hired those students afterwards to actually work with us. This is the line score, the box score, and the play-by-play from a game a little more than 2 years ago, the White Sox in Seattle, in fact. I should say about the play-by-play that it's actually in English. It's play-by-plays are telegraphic English, but it's a limited vocabulary English. So it's sort of this is things like X gets a double, X X strikes out, things like that. Okay, and we just put them in this sort of quasi-numerical form. To make it clear that it's not really English exactly. And the main thing I think that's clear is, by the way, you can't take a wall of data in and produce a wall of text. That's not a story, right? I mean, anyway, you push this little button here, and this is not cache, so it'll.
How much do you need to know about baseball to do this?
I'll show you a little bit about what it knows about baseball. Down to their last out, Griffey saves Mariners. Seattle. The Seattle Mariners were down to their final out when Ken Griffey came to the plate against reliever Tony Pena on Wednesday, but he delivered a single to carry the Mariners to a 1-0 victory over the Chicago White Sox in a 14-inning marathon at Safeco Field. After Adrian Beltre singled and Jack Hannahan walked, the game was tied. I like that. It was 0-0. When Griffey came to the plate against Pena with 2 outs and runners on first and second, he singled, scoring Beltre from second, which gave the Mariners a lead for good. So this is a pretty good story. Actually, this story is about as good as, and we haven't done any formal evaluation, but actually a number of sports writers. There was a sports writer at the Toronto Star who actually, on his own, without ever having any conversation with us, he grabbed one of our stories and then a story that he'd written about that game, and he did a kind of side-by-side comparison. And he was pretty happy, actually. He also noticed that ours was grammatically correct and his wasn't. But I don't think that's so important. By the way, I want to make it clear that we have nothing interesting to say about text generation per se, and we make no claims about that. It's a very standard, phrasal generator. It's a special purpose phrasal generator with gaps that that it walks the tree and generates the subpiece and so forth. There's nothing there. Well, there's something there, but that's not the part that we really. There's nothing innovative there. Why don't I put it that way? Okay.
You may have said this, but how do you know that the facts are correct? For example, that Ken Griffey works for the Seattle Mariners.
Well, we got these. So this stuff comes from a company called Stats Inc., which has the contract to do most major league sports in the United States. Stats Inc. is owned jointly by the AP and Fox Sports. It's actually based in Northbrook, Illinois, and their stats are pretty good. Although occasionally there are problems, and we can talk a little bit about the issue of data validation, which came up today also. Talk ahead.
So that was this whole list of facts.
Yeah. You give it that. Okay. So actually, data validation is a big issue for us. Obviously, I mean, if you don't get the right data, I want to say something about. Let me talk a little bit about what it knows and a little bit about. Let's talk about what it does first of all. So it does two things basically. It does an analytics based on. Some of it is based on sort of sabermetrics ideas. For example, this is based on Bill James's game score model. These things are actually. It also uses predictive modeling to help identify useful positions in the game. So, in other words, if you predict that something's going to happen, and then after a play, your predictions change a lot, that was an important play. So and also threshold crossing. So, I mean, I don't want to actually make this sound too complicated. I mean, if a company is cash flow negative one quarter and cash flow positive the next quarter. So crossing zero is always a big deal, you know what I mean? So there's a couple of simple things like maximum, minima, thresholds, and you can think of them yourself that turn out to be drivers for potentially interesting events or things and situations. And after having built all of these derived features, it then builds this outline. And the outline, actually, I'll go back to this in a second. The outline shows a little bit about what it thinks is going on. So this system is a kind of a big expert system, and what it has is it has big semantic models of situations like this that it's trying to match to this game. Okay, in this instance, the one that works here is called "Take the Lead Late," is actually the model that actually matched this. And if you think about what they are, you can think about. I'll actually tell you about the rhetorical structure of a baseball game recap because we talked about this last night. We thought the reporters would actually have well thought out rhetorical models of kinds of stories. They don't. And I think this is because reporting, I think maybe long form, like magazine reporters might, but news reporters don't. And I think it's because it's a very ephemeral medium. You know what I mean? It's like, it doesn't matter. You're right. It doesn't have to be well written. It has to work. And so they don't really angst about exactly what does a baseball game recap look like. They just write them. Here's what a baseball game recap, it turns out, looks like. The first part of a baseball game recap is what happened and why it happened. What was the outcome and why was that the outcome, okay? What led to that outcome? The second part of a baseball game recap is the pitching. You must talk about the pitching. And the third part of a baseball game recap is other interesting stuff that happened, okay, in chronological order, all right? Or actually, alternatively, in order based on organized around the players, okay? So those are the two ways you can do that section, okay? And different kinds of patterns matter in different parts of this structure. So for example, at the beginning part, what matters is, was it a come from behind victory? Was it a take the lead late? Was it a blowout? Was it a back and forth the whole way? Was it piling on at the end, okay? And you can do this from either point of view. You know, you can either have a comeback, or you can have a comeback that almost makes it, but not. You can almost have a late victory, but not quite. And from the point of view of the people who actually won, that's called holding off. right? You held them off at the end, right? And in addition to those, it has a bunch of actually other kinds of angles that are around sort of how did that come to be. So for example, it has an angle for heroic individual effort, where it can look in the game data and find this player in these places made the difference, versus great team effort. Okay, and again, these patterns are visible in the data, and it finds them and actually uses them to actually figure out how it's going to describe what happened in the game. I hope that makes sense.
So, I'm curious, is there any kind of, I'm wondering, like, it seems like sometimes these stories probably talk about events that are sort of external to the game, like there's some scandal involving the players or something like that. So have you thought about looking at like Wikipedia or Freebase or something?
Right, so we actually do, so we are interested in pulling out, well, first of all, you'll notice that the thing actually pulled out Griffey's picture, so it had to go and actually go somewhere to do that, okay? I think it's Griffey's picture. I can't believe we have to I'm sorry that it doesn't even cache it then. Okay, yeah, it is Griffey's picture. You know, it doesn't really, so we do go out and find stuff. And one of the nice things about doing this in this context is your query is very specific, because you know exactly what you're looking for. Like, I'm looking for a quote by this player about this play in this game, in this location, at this time, okay? I would be very excited, and we haven't quite done this yet, to analyze tweets from people who were at the game. I think that would be awesome, and pull them back, especially around things like, so to get that extra stuff that happened that you can't quite get. And again, you have to be able to anticipate what that might be. So I think it's pretty obvious that you can get either people's reactions to, or descriptions of why, or better descriptions of particular events. I mean, if a spaceship lands in the middle of the field during the game, I'm not sure what we'll be able to make of that, you know what I'm saying? But if somebody hurts themselves, well, you can expect that somebody might get injured in the game, and so you actually should be looking out for that, right? I'm sorry. Excuse me. This was just there in case I didn't have connectivity. So we actually are doing all Big Ten football, baseball, basketball, and women's softball games, previews, in-game updates. We tweet during the games, and we also do recaps after the games. And you might say, well, I want to talk about why we think this matters. So the thing is, there's no point in having a machine write Big Ten football game stories. Big Ten football is a big deal. There's a lot of money in Big Ten football, and there will be no problem at all paying human reporters to go and write those stories. It's not a problem, okay? Big Ten women's softball, okay? It turns out that, so here's a story from last year. Kramer blanks Oakland to help Spartans win. It wasn't her best effort, but Lauren Kramer was the backbone in the Michigan State Spartans' 4-0 victory over the Oakland Golden Grizzlies on Thursday. The Golden Grizzlies weren't able to score a run off Kramer during her 7 innings on the mound. She allowed 5 hits, 2 walks, and struck out 9. It was the biggest win for Michigan State since their 9-2 win over Eastern Michigan on March 30th. We can get some historical stuff in there as the season progresses, okay? And actually, you can actually start to put in horse racing angles around the getting into the playoffs, for example. So you can actually start to change the stories towards the end of a season. They can become a little bit richer that way as well. So it turns out that like the Daily Northwestern publishes about 2 to 3 games about women's softball, about Northwestern's women's softball team every season, and the team plays 20 games, 25 games. Most of these games go unreported. And if you ask, even by the school newspapers, okay, and if you ask who wants to read a story about women's collegiate softball, I think the question, I mean, you know, who does? Who wants to read a story about women's collegiate softball?
Families.
Yeah, the kids on the team, their parents, their friends, you know, people, alumni who used to be on the team, okay? And in this great land of ours, I'm sure there are some people who actually care about women's collegiate softball just because they do, you know. I mean, it's got to be. It's a big country, you know. So I don't know how many people that is. 200 people? 2,000 people? Probably somewhere between 200 and 2,000 people. And yet the stories don't get written. They're never written. How much does it cost to write a story? It turns out that a stringer will be paid $50 to $75 to cover a sporting event by a newspaper. That's a labor of love. If he has to pay or she has to pay to get into the game, that'll be included. That comes out of that money. Transportation comes out of that money, okay? It is a labor of love. It's a thing that people do because they love to do it, and they go and they do it, okay? But it's still too expensive for women's collegiate softball. I mean, nobody will actually, so that's the idea. The idea is to actually say, look, there are things that just don't get reported on that you can get reported quickly and easily and cheaply this way if you can get the data. There's a company called Game Changer, which has a baseball scoring app for Little League and middle school and high school football teams available for iPhones and Androids. We generated 300,000 Little League stories last summer, all right? This program is now the nation's most prolific author of women's collegiate softball game stories, all right? And they're decent stories. What's the larger takeaway here? There's a lot of data. The other.
Read the stories?
I'm sorry?
Where will one read the stories?
Well, these stories show up on big10network.com. So you can read these stories on big10network.com. We're actually doing also very simple stock market stories. So the company Narrative Science now has actual clients, and some of them will attribute, and some of them will not attribute, depending on whether they actually want to make it clear that their stories are being written by machines. And some of them are happy to say that they are, and many of them, it turns out, are not so happy to say that. And we've gone back and forth on whether that matters to us or not. Two customers who I can actually tell you about are big10network.com, which is a joint venture of the Big Ten and Fox Sports again. And then also Forbes does we do stock market updates on Forbes. Those stories are much simpler, by the way. But anyway, if you want to read these, you can go here. There's a lot of data. I mean, this is a commonplace point. I mean, there's a tremendous amount of data out there, and we all understand that the data, it's an incredible opportunity and an incredible challenge at the same time. The data will be has to be made actionable if it's going to make a difference. And what will it mean to make it actionable? Either it's going to be actionable, taken by the machines automatically on the basis of the data, and that's going to happen a lot. But sometimes the data is going to have to be presented to people to make decisions. And if you ask, how are we thinking about doing that right now? I would say that for the most part, people are thinking about visualization. So a lot of work in visualization comes down to we're going to have to figure out a way to make the data understandable to people. So I'm just going to say that narrative is actually a time-honored method of conveying information. And for some kinds of things, especially things that have some of a temporal component, they seem like a really good way of actually presenting that. We talked about all these things. Here's a partial list of the baseball angles in case you're interested in what does it know about baseball. These are the kinds of patterns it has that it's looking for. And again, these are all built by hand. So a lot of our job actually as technologists is to come up with tools that make it easy to do this and libraries of these things that allow us to do abstraction properly. I'll give you an example. If a team could win because of one player doing a great job or because everybody does a good job, a company can meet its earnings expectations for the quarter because every division did a little bit better than expected or because one division did dramatically better than expected. And those situations strike me as very analogous in my mind. And right now, when we write these things, we're writing them separately. But I think in my mind, we have to actually get these abstractions right so that we can do that. I'll give you another example of the kind of thing I'm very excited about right now. We're coming to the end of the talk, and I apologize. I'll summarize quickly. I'm very excited about situations like this. A team gets a lot of hits, gets a lot of men on base, doesn't get a lot of scores, runs, loses the game. A team gets a lot of yardage, completes a lot of passes, gets a lot of first downs, doesn't score a lot of touchdowns, loses the game, okay? A company, increases market share, launches new products, blah, 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 still doesn't improve its profits very much, okay? I mean, what do these situations have in common? What they have in common is you're achieving your instrumental goals and you're failing to achieve your ultimate external objective, okay? So sometimes this is called failing to capitalize on your opportunities, right? You build the preconditions for achieving some success and then fail to ultimately put it together to achieve the success. That's a good example of a kind of semantic angle that I'm interested in getting into these machines to be able to tell those stories. I'm also, go on.
You haven't talked a lot about the choice of vocabulary.
Right.
Is that just not interesting, or do you use?
I think it's really interesting, but I have nothing interesting to say about it. I mean, I think it's a phenomenal. I think it's a great problem, but so that.
You always use the Same vocabulary, so you do
Well,
all
we
those-
have a lot we do. I mean, so so let me tell you a couple things about that. I mean, so the variance that I am most interested in is the variance that makes a meaningful difference. In other words, I'm telling it from the winner's point of view or the loser's point of view, or this is what really happened in the game, and so it changes how we're going to talk about it. It is certainly the case that if you read a lot of our stories over and over and over again, we should actually be thinking about other kinds of variation. I wish I could say to you that every single variation we put in there is a thoughtful decision. It isn't always. You obviously have to put some variation of lexical choice in just so that they don't all read the same way, even though, and I think that's fine. I have nothing against that. That's probably the place where we're going to start doing our mining, by the way. I mean, that's a place where I think that we could do a better job gathering that stuff statistically to do. I mean, I think starting at the edges is where you'd probably make progress automating some of this stuff. I could certainly see doing the Marty Hurst kind of thing where I take, for instance, a bunch of stuff about the team or a bunch of the data and the names that were relevant to a sentence that we generated and go out and find a lot of other sentences that mentioned exactly the same things and see what words they used. And at the very least, you could present that to a human to mine if you didn't do anything more intelligent with it. I'm interested in this also, like this is what a comeback looks like in baseball, this is what a comeback looks like in basketball, this is what a held off looks like in basketball. And we don't do this yet either, but I'm kind of interested in the idea of getting a program to say, here's a story with the same angle, the same actors, but different details, same angle, same details, different actors. This is sort of compare and contrast in some ways, right? Same angle cross-domain or the imposing angle. Like the last time they were in this situation, they held them off, but this time they failed to hold them off and they lost the game, right? I think that's kind of a nice, that'll enrich the stories a lot. I don't have a lot more time. I want to talk a little bit briefly about, I want to talk a little bit about thematic, about themes. So these angles are kind of like big themes. I think they're like, one thing I actually came to realize about sports, now is the time for me to confess that I'm actually not inherently interested in sports or in sports writing. So this has a slightly ironic. This was a slightly ironic moment in my career, really. But I came to realize that the reason why people like sports is that sports are actually about human virtues and failings. I mean, they're about persistence or failing to persist, or heroism or failing to. I mean, they're about these kinds of human. They're sort of Greek in that way. You know what I mean? They have that kind of Greek. They're about big human themes, really, you know. And I'm really interested in these kinds of themes. They're very hard to detect, for machines to actually detect, to look at a situation and say, actually to look at a story. So here's an example of what I mean. The London riots just went on. A number of people characterized these riots as, by mentioning the epigram, idle hands are the devil's playground. And that's what I mean by a big theme. So here's a theme. A lot of people, when the economy was melting down about 3 or 4 years ago, Hank Paulson was the Secretary of the Treasury. He was in charge of the TARP. It was not uncommon to say, putting Hank Paulson in charge of the TARP is like setting the fox to guard the hen house. Okay, and I'm interested in this kind of tagging because it's not topical exactly. It's not topical tagging. Topical tagging would be things like it's a business story, or it's a political story, or it's a story about the TARP. It's not topical and it's not sentiment, it's sort of something else, and I'm kind of excited about it. Just so that you can see there were 135,000 results for this. Paulson TARP glitters gold actually got a fair number of things too. Now, probably what I want to do eventually is, I'm not sure I want to use these numbers, so actually we're looking at whether these numbers alone are sufficient to know whether people really thought this was a good label for this or not. But I think we're going to have to look inside of the actual documents and see whether somebody explicitly said this is like this. That's kind of the ultimate gold standard for that. By the way, news stories don't do that. Reporters don't say that because that's opinionizing. They'll only do it if they find somebody to say that they can quote. Okay? Headline writers will say it because headline writers have more leave. Comments to news stories. That's where people put these labels on them. It's in the comments on the stories that you see this kind of thing coming out. This is an example I just want to show very quickly of something we built recently. Actually, I had nothing to do with this. I was very excited though because whatever your teacher, you are always excited when your DNA your intellectual DNA, for better or worse, shows up in your students. And our student Patrick McNally and a student of his named Don, and I've forgotten his last name, but they came up with this idea of looking for the 7 deadly sins on Twitter. And again, it's a relatively simple model, but here they are. Here's sloth. Do anyone Mabel, Bedford, Garfield, or Warrensville see snow? Too lazy to look. Gluttony. This is for you, Susan. Could really go for some peanut butter cookies. Craving. Greed. I need my money pronto. Craving Starbucks coffee. Wow, how hard is it to block the Raiders? This is pissing me off. Rivers is pissing me off. He just stands there with a welcome mat. I ate so much sushi and now I'm in pain. So actually, it's actually kind of fun to watch these, you know. And I was thinking if we get accurate enough, we could imagine actually doing you know, today's world today in world sin. You know, what's today's winner?
We could do that in topic modeling. We could treat this as a semi-supervised learning. It would be fun.
Yeah, I think so. But what I like about it, I mean, I think that A, I think that's right. But B, what I like about it is I like this angle on things. I like saying, you know, it's like this is a kind of way of looking at the data. And maybe this really gets to the point. I mean, to actually blow this out will often require a lot of statistical work. But what I like about it is that it's a way of looking at the data which starts from some thematic point of view that says the sins are actually a particular lens through which to look at what people are saying about the world. I'm going to skip this one. A couple of quick current projects. So this is the things we're doing in our course this quarter. We're doing this Twitter profiling system, news and blog recommendations based on your tweet history. And this solves a problem for, if you're like a big organization, people click all over you all day long or type queries to you, and so you can begin to understand who they are and what they care about. If you're a smaller organization, where do you get the data from? And if they use Twitter, you might just get the data from them if they will tell you what their Twitter handle is. So actually Paul's team has a project, actually something like this, it turns out, this morning. The news of the day, I kind of like this, and it's sort of been done, but it hasn't really been done. Like there are a lot of things out there like CRM systems that do like Salesforce.com will, if you're going to meet with somebody, they'll bring up, of course, the entire history of meetings with them, but also your emails with them or their LinkedIn profile. A bunch of things like that get brought up automatically. There's a system called Reportive, I think, that does that. But I haven't seen one that brings up news about the company that actually says, look at your calendar. But there may well be. In any case, we gave it to these students, so it's looking up. At the very least, you'll know if the stock tanked this morning before you go in the door to meet somebody, or vice versa, you know what I mean? Or a new CEO was named, or whatever, you know, a new product was launched. So it tries to look up the people you're meeting with and the organization they're from and just display that to you based on your calendar. I mean, the notion was if you're a honcho, of course, you get a briefing, you get somebody actually, I'm sure this is still printed out for that matter. I'm sure it's actually, for a lot of people, it gets put into a manila folder and handed to them in the morning or something like that, you know. When they get in the back of their car, it's given to them. This is a thing actually to do automatic news and social media aggregation for city council elections. It was actually done for the Seattle City Council elections that just happened last week because Chicago's aldermanic elections were last year, so we wanted to pick one that was current. I then discovered that Seattle has a very bizarre system where everybody's at large, but they run for at-large seats against each other, which makes no sense to me whatsoever, but okay. It's a really crazy, in other words, there's like a seat called seat 1, and 2 people compete for seat 1 citywide, and there's seat 3, and 2 people compete for seat 3 citywide. I don't get it. Okay. You know, it's like a very odd model. But so this is not a deep project, but this is a good example of where there's like a need. So there are a number of people, of clever people in the news business who have done things like, okay, I'm going to do automatic aggregation of Twitter feeds from the campaigns and their Facebook page, and I'll actually automatically look up the news. I'll have some query running in the background that will always feed me, you know, stuff. Okay. It's surprising how many news organizations do this by hand. A news organization that I visited earlier this year, they were very proud to show me a thing that they had done for a city council election and I looked at it and it was like everything was stale. And I said, wow, this is kind of stale. He said, yeah, I'm not updating it anymore. I said, well, what do you mean? And he said, well, yeah, I put all this data in and I actually curate by hand every day. I go through news stories and I put the links in there. And I'm like, you know, what I was thinking was, are you kidding me? But okay. So it's not a big deal. It's not a big project. But if we make this simple and configurable, this will matter to news organizations. I mean, it's not rocket science, but they don't, you know, things that are not rocket science, if they can be robust, reliable, and easy to use, will get used. The porkometer is we're looking to see if we can identify earmarks in federal legislation. I'd like to do state legislation as well, if we can get this to work. I think we can. Twitter debate is sort of like the Twitter version of News at 7. You know, tweets are very atomized things, and I'm wondering whether you can make them a little more meaningful by putting them in a context. So originally we thought we would say like Perry on Social Security and Romney on Social Security and have a back and forth. Twitter does not afford that. You can't do an extended debate in Twitter. What I think you can do is ABA. It's like you can do point, counterpoint, final comeback. Okay, so we're actually trying to organize. That's the rhetorical structure we're trying to organize tweets into, topically speaking, for political candidates. So that's that project, and again, I think it's kind of fun. Quick blurb about us. We just got this. I mean, we've been doing things like this. It's very, you know, I think as everybody discovers, you know, you build a cool project, and then getting it actually out into the world is like an entire other universe of pain that you may or may not actually have any capacity to do. I mean, even an organization like this where you're sitting on the edge of an entire gigantic campus of people whose job it is to build and ship products to people worldwide, I'm sure getting their attention and getting their mind share and getting them to say, no, really, we do want what you have, and get, you know, it's a nightmare, isn't it? You know, so, and we had the same problem where we build these really cool prototypes and then they'd fall on the ground and nobody would ever pick them up and use them. And so we got tired of that. The Knight Foundation, it turns out, was also tired of that. They've been seeding a lot of technology in the news space for the last 5 years and felt it had a good impact in terms of building interest and expertise in the field, but the specific technology projects were not necessarily getting picked up and used. So we started talking together about our joint pain here and eventually decided that we would actually build an incubator or development system thing for these, for news technologies at Northwestern. So technology that we invent, also technologies that are invented elsewhere, you know, will come into that pipeline and get built out. It still is a fair amount of money they put behind it. They put about $4 million behind it over the next 4 years, which goes a long way in a university. And what can I think I'm hopeful. You know, I mean, I'm loving what narrative science is doing right now, but that's an example of going the other way. I mean, I hope that we'll be able to have our technology have impact through that, but that's a big deal. You're starting a company and you're getting venture capital and you're getting management, and it's a completely different, again, it's a lot of work to do that. I'm hoping that this will be a way of actually sort of speeding that, at least earlier on in stages, to see that.
So what's the delivery channel in this case?
Well, we're starting out with media partners in the Chicago area, so large and small media organizations, and very broadly construed. It could be nonprofits or governmental organizations, you know, the PTA, or the Sun-Times, or WBEZ, which is the local public radio station. So all these organizations we're starting to work with. We've actually hired an executive director from the media business in Chicago who actually knows all these people personally, so that's been a really great boon to us. And we're starting to hire some developers because, again, there are things you can't ask graduate students to do, like, you know, use version control. I mean, they do use version control. Version control is the date is appended to the file name. You know, that's the kind of version control that, and I understand that because that's what I did when I was a student too. But when you're actually going to ship product to the Chicago Sun-Times, it turns out you can't possibly do that. So you know, it's like, yes, we will use Git, and we will actually do these kinds of things. So it's pretty exciting. I'm looking forward to it. I think the Twitter profiling project is probably the first we're going to be shipping out. And you know, if they work, I mean, we're not really sure what the final thing is. I mean, if something actually clicks, I mean, we might actually just put it out open source. It might be the case that other companies get started. I don't know. I want to thank my research partner, Chris Hammond, all of our students. Nick Allen and John Templon built the narrative generation system with us. Jay Budzig, of course, did Watson along with a number of other folks there. Francisco Iacobelli did Tell Me More. Jiawei Liu did a number of the projects I showed you, Compare and Contrast. Patrick McNally did the last thing I just showed you on Lust, and I guess Lust was not up there, but Sloth and Gluttony. Nate Nichols did News at 7. Sean is doing the Twitter profiling thing. I guess I'll stop there. Earl Wagner kind of helped me dream up and actually did more of it than me, the thematic tagging stuff. And these are my colleagues over in the School of Journalism. Thank you very much. Further questions? I guess people ask them. Thank you. I enjoyed that. Let me know if any of these things seem interesting to you. I mean, I'm really here partly because I feel like, you know, our kind of, I realize this is still running, so I'm going to choose my words. You know, we tend to be pretty seat of the pants, I'll put it that way, in terms of how we get these things built. And a lot of the times that works pretty well, and sometimes it doesn't work quite as well. So if any of these projects seem interesting to you, for example, I think it'd certainly be interested in talking about what we might do to sort of push them forward together. So.
And you're going to be meeting with lots of folks
Okay,
around
good.
maybe 3 or 4 thematical groups. So one's web, IR, machine learning, one's
Great.
social, one's NLP.
Great. Thank you very much.